Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the first Habsburg stage session, Tyson Barker.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the start of the day, the start of the Habsburg conference room. I am delighted to have you guys here. I'm Tyson Barker from the German Council on Foreign Relations, and we are going to be talking about transatlantic tech today. And I think that there are very few issues that could be more timely, especially given the fact that we are just at this exact moment in Brussels. A US-EU summit is taking place. President Biden is meeting with the leaders of the EU to discuss exactly these issues. So what we want to do today is give you guys a little preview of what we think they should be discussing and what might be on the agenda. I think we're all aware that when the US delegation came to Europe, they highlighted what they called the 3 C's as their priorities: COVID, China, and climate. But I want to add 3 more C's to that to round it out. I want to add connectivity, commerce, and cyber. And I think that all 3 of these C's, which deal with the digital agenda, are enabling of the rest of the transatlantic agenda generally and what we want to see in a democratic world order. We had this meeting at the G7. There was some discussion around digital technology and specifically countering ICT and the Belt and Road Initiative. At NATO yesterday, they announced new work on emerging disruptive technologies. And today, they're going to be launching what we assume will be a trade and tech council to really delve into these issues. And a question that I have, looking at the rule book that the European Commission is planning is, are we looking at perhaps the hidden G2 for democratic tech? And to answer that question, we have 4 excellent speakers with us. Here with me today on the stage is Fran Burwell. Fran came to us from the United States, so welcome, Fran, to Slovakia and to Europe. Fran is a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council and a senior director at McLarty Associates. And then joining us virtually, we have 3 additional speakers. We have Anna Michelle Asimakopoulou, who is a member of the European Parliament from the EPP group from Greece. She is also the vice chair on the Committee for International Trade and a member of the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence in the Digital Age. So thank you, Anna Michelle, for being with us virtually. Third, we have Anna Fielder. She is the president of EDRI in Brussels, and she has been working on digital rights for a number of years. She's really was present at the creation of a lot of discussions around digital rights, privacy, and data protection. She is currently a senior policy advisor and chair emerita of Privacy International, and was a senior advisor to the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue, and really put these issues on the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue's agenda at the inception of this dialogue in 1998. So welcome, Anna. Thank you for joining us remotely as well. And last but not least, we have Marta Poslad. Marta is the head of public policy and government relations for Central and Eastern Europe and the transatlantic policy lead at Google. She is also a Humanity in Action Senior Fellow, an Aspen Institute Young Leader, and an alumnus of the Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights Program. Welcome, Marta. Thanks for joining us as well.
Thank you for having me today.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start with Fran. So we've got this big idea, this Transatlantic Trade and Tech Council, a lot of wish lists out there for what should be on the agenda. What do you think should be the priorities? How do you scope this type of council?
Well, I think it's a good initiative first. I mean, I think that's an important initiative because it's time for the US and for the EU to talk together on these particular issues. However, there is a long history of dialogues, councils between the United States and the EU fading into obscurity, and we don't want that to happen. I think the number one important point is simply to put these items in a more prominent place in the agenda. This is a major transatlantic market. And just to give you one data point, the United States companies, they supply about $200 billion worth of information services in Europe, compared to $3.5 billion in China 21 billion in Latin America. So just so you see what a market the transatlantic market is. So it's important to address that in a sustained, continuing manner and to get policymakers to actually talk about these things. We do suspect that the first priority of this will be the easy priority, the thing on which we already agree, which is more resilient infrastructures, security, cybersecurity standards, and all of these types of things that we both, the United States and Europe, see as important for our digital economies. So a very positive agenda on that. However, it's the Trade and Tech Council. And there's clearly, at least in the documents that have been leaked so far, there clearly, and in the reports that have emerged, there clearly is an element of keeping trade in this council. And it's not clear to me that these two agendas, if we want to talk about trade barriers and things like that, it's not clear to me that they mesh well together, but we'll have to see. It's also not clear that the Trade and Tech Council has a mandate right now to talk about some of the more challenging issues, such as competition policy, privacy, and some of the other many challenging issues that we find, for example, in trying to restore or in trying to reassure companies about data transfers between the United States and the EU. So there are a lot of issues that we're not quite clear if they're going to be covered in this. We'll have to see. We're not quite clear who's going to lead it and whether they will have the required ability to reach throughout the US government and throughout the Commission and the EU to bring forces together to have a really constructive discussion. But it's an important step forward. We should all give everyone a big round of applause for doing this. And now we'll have to see how it develops.
Thanks so much for that opener. Anna Michelle, you are watching this from the European Parliament. You are in the both in the Trade Committee, very senior role in the Trade Committee, and in the AI Committee. One of the big issues that keeps coming up in these conversations is technical standards. And a lot of the leaks that have come out already talk about standard setting convergence, the role of the US and EU working together to really set these standards. Where do you see potential here, and where do you see pitfalls?
Well, Tyson, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be discussing this really important topic with such distinguished company. You mentioned the 3 C's. I think we're now waiting for the 3 D's. We're waiting for the leaders to deliver, and we're waiting for a deal, and we're waiting for them to do what is necessary, frankly, to make sure that they safeguard what I call democracy 2.0. So having said that, I agree that, we're waiting for this Trade and Tech Council. It's definitely a move in the right direction. It'll definitely be dealing with these issues. This is what I expect to be on the table: AI, cyber, standards across the board, even for pharmaceuticals, for example. Clearly, we also need to deal with quantum computing. So these are the issues I would see there. And of course, we expect some solutions. For example, for for SHREM 2, I mean, I understand that this is a difficult issue. I understand the legal aspects of it, but quite frankly, I think that we need to find a short-term solution that will provide at least some sort of certainty legally to industry. After all, we're talking about €1 trillion a year worth of commerce, of which data is sort of the lifeblood. So we need some certainty, even if we proceed in a more multilateral context for a longer-term solution. Now, on the trade aspects, delighted to see that VP Dombrovskis just tweeted that there's a deal on Airbus and Boeing. From what I understand, this is sort of a 5-year moratorium until we can figure out how to deal with this and how to deal with subsidies across the board, maybe with China as well. So that's definitely good news. It certainly shows that there is a will. And frankly, where there is a will, there is a way. And that goes for steel as well, because this is a big issue for the EU. I mean, you can't really say we're partners in NATO and that we're a threat to national security. So 232 safeguards and standards, steel tariffs need to be addressed at some point with respect to trade. Now, I agree that we don't want this council to turn into just, another discussion forum. It sounds to me like because of the high level leadership, it's going to be something that has lots of potential to progress. And in order to do so, we need, I think, a strict timetable, set deliverables, and we need to put our priorities to get our priorities straight. And our priorities definitely have to be around common standards. The European Union has an AI Act on the table. I don't see why that can't be an excellent starting point for discussion. And in the trade sector, I think we need to talk about supply chains. These are issues that affect both of us, resilience and diversification of supply chains. We need to talk about semiconductors. We need to talk about critical raw materials if we're going to deal with climate change effectively in our digital transformation. So I think I'll stop at that. It's an ambitious agenda, but it's an essential agenda. And I'll just say that what we need to be doing more than ever now is burying the hatchet and focusing on what brings us together and not on what could set us apart.
Thanks so much, Anna Michelle. Anna Michelle mentioned where there's a will, there's a way. And Fran mentioned some of the tough issues, the sticky issues, one of which was Privacy Shield. Anna Michelle mentioned Schrems 2, the decision. Clearly, we have a lot of uncertainty right now in the transatlantic personal data flow space. What do you see as the likelihood that we can get to a solution on a new Privacy Shield to create certainty for transatlantic data flows? And what do you think needs to happen to get there?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me at this important meeting. Just to clarify, EDRI stands for European Digital Rights, which is Europe's sole community for digital rights advocates. We have about 45 member organizations. Your important questions, I largely agree with Fran's analysis, and data flows and the Privacy Shield is the elephant in the room that needs to be addressed. However, if there is a new Privacy Shield, as sure as night comes after day, there will also be a Schrems number 3. So as a digital rights community, we think that really the only long-term solution is for the US to modify its surveillance laws and practices, because that's what the CGAU judgment was based on. This is not just our opinion. About 3 days ago or so, Vice President Vera Jourova said exactly the same thing. In a public meeting, she said, pass new laws if you want data transfer deal. So that's very important. But also, last but not least, you've got the whole US digital rights community, consumer groups and digital rights groups, all agreeing that having an effective federal level privacy legislation is not just good for EU consumers, it's what the US people want as well and have wanted for many years. In fact, a coalition of them have recently written to President Biden requiring such laws to be implemented. In 2019, there were no less than 11 data protection privacy law proposals in the US Congress. None of them have been implemented so far, we assume because there is no will in the Senate to support it. So, that is the long-term viable solution. I'll stop now. I have a lot to add on the rest of the agenda, which is, by the way, very welcome and timely. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anna. Marta, as Anna mentioned, this is a pretty broad agenda. And, when you talk about tech policy these days, you're just really talking about policy because tech touches on everything. Digital touches on everything. And one of the things that it touches on is the strategic orientation that Europe wants to create. And they have created a term that is used often in Brussels and Paris and Berlin, which is digital sovereignty. And I want to ask you, what do you see under this term? How does Central Europe work with this term? And what does this mean for the transatlantic digital relationship, this idea of digital sovereignty?
Thank you so much, Tyson. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. And first of all, I would just like to recognize how great this is that we're in an almost all-female panel on transatlantic issues. Doesn't happen very often, so well done to the organizers, especially on this very special day of the EU-US summit that is happening in the background, or actually has just concluded. Thank you for your great question on strategic directions Europe wants to take. Over, say, past 18 months, we've heard different concepts, different interpretations, be it strategic autonomy, sovereignty, digital sovereignty. And I would say that looking at the sequence of what happened in the past few days with the President Biden's visit to G7, NATO conversations yesterday, I think there are foundations to start looking into strategic interdependence. My view is that no matter how you interpret digital sovereignty, still a more negative take could be taken out of that discussion. And I honestly feel that after a few rough years of the transatlantic relationship and looking at the commitments already made throughout the past 5 days, interdependence is what we should be looking at, recognizing everything that both sides bring to the table, or more sides when you look at broader forums like G7. But I think if there's one commitment that stands out from all the summits that have taken place, is a joint recognition of global threats, a need to work together, and that should be and that should be the takeaway. Together with everything that my other co-panelists brought up, there are very concrete things on the table, be it trade issues, one unerased, or privacy shield than that other unerased. What I would add to the mix is that I truly believe that if we want TTC to be a meaningful tool, we should already look into what is being discussed on both sides of the Atlantic, like, for example, DSA and DMA in Europe, that would have a significant transatlantic effect, would have a global effect on how technology works. And that's where we would see meaningful outcomes of the TTC. And I think when it comes to Central and Eastern Europe in specific, and a take on strategic be it autonomy or digital sovereignty, I would say that there's probably kind of a distinction when it comes to takes of governments in this region, and I think that comes from that is for two reasons. One is historical, and the role of the US in shaping post-communist countries, and probably a greater openness to seek diversity of, in this case, tech supply, and a second reason to it is this hunger for catching up and leapfrogging and seeking all possible opportunities globally to really get the best access to solutions, be it within tech or other industries. And I could only wish that this part of Europe would be playing an even more significant role in the debate on future strategic directions.
Thanks so much, Marta. We're going to do another round, and I want to mention now that we're going to open it up for questions. There are 3 ways that you guys can ask questions. We have an audience here. We're slowly edging into post-COVID times, and we do have an audience. If you are in the audience, there are microphones on the side, so just raise your hand and go to one of the mics. Otherwise, you can ask a question on Slido over the GLOBSEC app, or you can ask a question over Zoom. So we've got 3 opportunities, 3 ways to ask questions, and please start to think of what you want to ask our great panelists. Fran, I want to pick up on this issue of digital sovereignty, because it's something that you hear a lot in Brussels, in Berlin, and Paris. I don't know if you hear as much of it in Central Europe, but you're sitting in Washington. How does Washington interpret this kind of strategic doctrine or orientation, and what do they see behind it?
Well, I think it is kind of a mystery to many in Washington as to why this has become so important. I think to some degree Washington needs some consciousness raising. I think that if we found, for example, that we were all buying stuff on a French marketplace and we were getting our information from a German company, that we would want to think again about the balance of where companies are and why we hadn't done so well in creating companies. But there's a difference between creating companies and supporting research and things like that. And I think that in the United States, when people hear about Europe's Horizon 2020 and other plans, the recovery funds, 20% going to digital, that's all great. The question is, does digital sovereignty start leading into protectionism? And we've had a couple of instances where it has at first appeared that way, and then it has moderated, but sometimes not all the way. For example, there are lots of American companies that are engaged in Gaia X, the cloud service providing, but not on the governing council. And so that is a question mark. The DMA, the Digital Markets Act, was mentioned, and I think that this is probably the biggest question, one that, as far as we can tell, is not really on the Trade and Tech Council agenda. But as this proposal is written right now, it looks like it will be a series of laws that apply only to American companies, that only American companies will have reached the threshold where this law will apply. So I think that digital sovereignty is something that in the United States raises question about sovereign from whom? Aren't we supposed to be in this together? And I think that the notion and the ability to overcome the misunderstandings that such a term can create is one of the principal benefits that I hope we will see from the Trade and Tech Council.
Anna Michelle, just looking at this through the context of digital sovereignty, we have the Digital Services Act, which really deals with content moderation. And we have the Digital Markets Act, which is looking at tipping and gatekeepers and market power of digital services. And there is an impression that both are kind of tailored to the experience that has occurred over the past 15 years of online platforms, primarily coming out of the United States. But if you look at the artificial intelligence regulation, there is a lot of reflection there of the experience we're seeing in China. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the deliberations in the European Parliament when you look at things like social scoring and how that's being implemented into the regulation, or things like remote biometric identification, et cetera. And to what extent is that inflected by new experiences in rising powers like China?
I'd say this is a vivid and vibrant discussion in the Parliament in the context of all this legislation that's on the table that you discussed. But generally, when we talk about these emerging technologies, and I think that these are major points of potential convergence with the United States, because when you talk about, how these technologies can actually be used, then you have to talk about the principles that guide them and the rules that will regulate this entire situation. And I understand that this discussion that we just had about tech sovereignty and open strategic autonomy, I understand that this, makes these, little bells ring in the back of our heads, because we're not just talking about protection, which we have joint interests in sometimes, but protectionism. And that's not at all how I see it. In fact, I just coming full circle around this issue, when we talk about autonomy in Europe's strategic autonomy, one of the reasons that we're doing it is that we want to become stronger geopolitically. And quite frankly, the stronger we become, the stronger partners we can be for the United States and for the world. A chain is only as strong as each of its links. And actually, I like to remind people, because I'm I'm Greek, that autonomy is a Greek word. It comes from aftos, which means self, and nomos, which means law. And literally what it means is you're safeguarding your right to make the rules. And this is what this is about. This is about who has the power depends largely on who makes the rules in the digital age, who decides whether social scoring is acceptable. I think that we'll find lots of convergence points over making these types of rules. And this is actually something that the European Union knows how to do pretty well. If you see, what we did in GDPR, these rules became global standards, the so-called Brussels effect. So why not work together with democracy and protection of civil rights and the rule of law in a multilateral context? And who is better to inspire the world than a great union of the United States and Europe around these issues, which are going to determine the future of democracy?
Anna, we're starting to see a change. We're hearing a lot of language on both sides of the Atlantic about who's setting the rules. And a lot of that is geared towards China, that just by virtue of the export of technologies, the export of artificial intelligence, software, ICT infrastructure, et cetera, that there is an implicit embedded rule-setting capability within those operations, and that China is becoming increasingly revisionist in the way that it sees global rules on things like privacy, data protection, data processing, surveillance, et cetera. And of course, we see that domestically in China. How much is this involved in the discourse around digital rights in Europe, looking at China and the kind of alternative model that it's looking to set? The Trade and Tech Council, from what I've read, is going to have a democracy pillar. What do you think should be in that democracy pillar, and how should it relate to authoritarian states like China, but also Russia?
That's a very good question. Thank you. The discussion amongst the digital rights community so far has been, and Fran touched a little bit on this, has been based on this issue of monopolistic control by a small number of big tech companies, mainly US companies. This is increasingly the case with companies in China, take TikTok, for example. So that's becoming part of the discussion. In terms of the democratic deficit, obviously, the practices in China and what's happening with the sort of state surveillance there in Russia are very important for the digital rights community, but is just beginning to focus on these issues. Most of the focus at the moment is about the monopolistic power of the big platforms. And actually, it's not just the discussion in the EU, it's in Europe, it's also the discussion in the US. You've had the reports from the Judiciary Committee, David Cicilline, that mentioned that this power has to be controlled. You have the DMA and the DSA in Europe. So I would say the reasons for all this sovereignty discussion is because, as also Anna Michel also mentioned, there is a need for the partners to be equal, for the two democracies to be together and work equal. And this is not going to happen so far as you have monopolistic platforms that control the content of what's going on online and therefore enable this data exploitation and big deficits to democracy, which frankly China and Russia can also take advantage of, as we've seen in recent elections.
Marta, this is obviously a point that Google is very familiar with. Google is the major player in search. It is one of the major players in ad tech, has a number of lines of service across which it uses data analytics, has developed a very successful business model. What is Google's position on the frankly, transatlantic discourse around market power of online platforms, of which I think 4 or 5 are really kind of in the crosshairs.
I think, thank you, Tyson, and also thank you, Anna, for pointing out the issue. So I think we've been very clear from the very beginning that we welcome everything that European Commission laid out very early in the term, because there is a shared consensus that those questions need to be resolved and need to be looked at from a close-up, and I think that points out the difference that there is between the US tech ecosystem versus the one associated with bad actors. That we enter those discussions, we open up ourselves to compliance, and we contribute. And I think we are part of the forums where we both contribute and listen to the feedback. And this is where we hope TTC will come in to embrace different perspectives, to embrace concerns and challenges that are shared between the US and Europe, bearing in mind our shared values, but also the necessities coming from what are the global challenges that I spoke about in my previous intervention. I think in the past weeks, at various occasions, we've heard, for example, different ideas about the scopes of the regulations we discussed already in this panel, such as DSA and DMA. So moving out, stretching that discussion over the Atlantic is a guarantee that scope would not be discriminatory in nature, would not only target specific companies, but we would be focusing on issues that will not outlive companies like Google, but will define rules for the future as well.
We're starting to get some good questions over Slido, and we have one question on Zoom. So I'm going to take one question from Slido, and then I'm going to take one question from Zoom from Jack Dalrymple from Australia. So our first question is from Ziga Turk, who asks, how can one hope to lead in standard setting if not leading in innovation? And I think that is a great question for Anna Michel.
I agree, they're absolutely intertwined, Tyson. Standard setting and innovation, these are intertwined. But I think that you'll find that Europe is ambitious with respect to innovation. I think it's unfair to to say that Europe isn't. I mean, Europe has really made major investments. I'm not going to go through all the funding that is available, but okay, when you compare it maybe to the budget that, for example, the United States has for AI announced, or if you compare it even to a lot of the funding that we've seen, I mean, China in 6 months invested something like $500 million in just 8 AI projects. But at the same time, you can't say the EU hasn't put this as a priority, hasn't focused on this, and hasn't had results. So I don't buy into the rhetoric that, we've lost the AI race, this is all finished. I don't buy into that at all. We have excellent talent in Europe. We have a strategy, we're investing money, and I'm not saying we don't need to collaborate, and I'm not saying that, China isn't going full speed, and the US as well, but Europe is certainly a player. And I think that setting the rules of the game is a big part of being able to master the game, if not win the game. And I'm not sure that that's the overall objective anyway. I mean, it's not just a race for power. It is, but it's not just that. It's also about setting the rules, and innovation is also about people. It's also about democracy. It's also about values. And I think we need an approach that is ideological, political, and also pragmatic. I mean, we are a global community, and we're going to have to be working together, and there are going to be diverging interests, and we need to find a way to do that. And the way to do that is to be sitting down at a table and agreeing on rules.
All right, we have a question from Zoom. Let's tee that up right now. Jack, you're online.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the discussions had so far, and lovely to be joining you from Melbourne, Australia, on the other side of the world. So far, the discussions had around EU-US privacy protections and data surveillance policies we obviously understand that those have broad implications on how other countries around the world utilize and share their data. It's already been discussed to some extent, the kind of strategic competition that's occurring between EU and the US and China, obviously. I want to understand from the panel, especially Anna, Michelle and Fran, what you think would be the implications of if the US and EU fail to actually come to an agreement on standard, kind of gold standard protections for individual people in using data. What does that look like, and what implications would that have on the global economy and I suppose this data future that we have?
Right, maybe Fran first and then Anna Michelle.
Sure. I think that over, say, 10 years, just to give a time frame, if there were not an understanding of how to do data transfers between the US and the EU, the first thing that would happen, I think, we're already seeing. In the wake of the two Schrems decisions, we're seeing more data localization here by companies, including American companies, who service data here, personally identifiable data. I think, however, that even if we don't have standards, then if we fail to come to a better understanding of standards, then even industrial data and how you use that, I think you'll start to see kind of a breakdown in the ability to transfer that. Or you will see in certain areas of the world, because I hope in 10 years the US will have privacy legislation that would prevent some abuses of data. But in areas that don't have effective privacy legislation, I think you'll see more of a Wild West type thing. And I think that that will go also for industrial data. There may be more stealing of data and things of that sort. And so I think that this is something that we have to work out, the US and the EU and other like-minded countries. And it may be that there's a role for the G7 in starting to do this. They have done digital data flows with trust. But I think that it is an important thing because if there aren't rules, we're just discovering now the way that data can be abused. And I think that there are lots of people with creative but not necessarily high-minded thoughts about how to use data.
Anna Michelle, what do you think? I mean, the European Parliament has very strong opinions about data privacy and GDPR, but Fran mentions a really good point, which is the scale of data processing is just increasing. I mean, we're just seeing more, with artificial intelligence, with facial voice recognition, the ability to reach into our lives and anticipate our own behavior and perhaps even manipulate our own behavior is just increasing. So how can the US and Europe really get this right? And what is the framework to do that?
Well, you know what they say, Tyson, they say nature hates a void, so it'll actually fill it. So if we don't do it, somebody else will. And, China's a pretty big player and it has a totally different conception of what privacy means. There is no, you don't have any privacy rights as a citizen. It's perfectly okay to surveil you every place. So if we want to avoid this model, anybody who doesn't sit down at the table, then other people, if you're not at the table, then somebody else will sit down at the table and make rules. And, actually, frankly, that, in the EU, let's not forget that national security is a national competence. So there are some issues when we talk about Schrems 2 and we talk about the new privacy shield and dealing with this matter. We don't just have the courts, the ECJ to consider. We also have to consider that a solution could be, let's say, sidebarred by nation states, members of the European Union, and the same thing in the United States. I mean, you have these states popping up with their own laws all over the place. Maybe it's a good idea to have a federal framework after all. So that's something to think about. But yes, in the Parliament, we're relentless when it comes to safeguarding people's privacy rights. And again, I don't want to make this, I understand the need to have a balance between strict regulation that protects our rights, and at the same time leaving enough room in a global context where there are other players that don't play by the same rules, that don't have such a high standard for privacy rights, in order for our industry to remain competitive. So you have to have safeguards on the side of the industrial policy as well. Having said all that, again, if we don't do it, somebody else will just do it for us, and that's just not a good idea. I mean, I don't want a Wild West, but I also don't want somebody else's autocratic model to be enforced either through the, at a table somewhere in a multilateral context that we're not involved in, or through the back door via companies and their technologies taking advantage of a legislative void.
We have got 5 minutes left. We've got one question here on Slido, which I'm going to direct to Marta, but I'm going to broaden it a little bit. So the question is, to what extent is digital autonomy affected by the EU's semiconductor dependence, with the US being dominant in chip design and Asia being dominant in high-end chip manufacturing? And I'm just going to expand this to say, to what extent is digital autonomy possible whenever the EU is dependent on key enabling technologies from outside the EU, not just semiconductors, but also, for example, cloud computing. How can the EU make sure that that is not putting it in a position of weakness or putting it in a position of strength vis-a-vis its partners and competitors?
Thank you, Tyson, and to the person that posed this question. I think that definitely shortage of specific beats, tools is one of the many reasons why those concepts of autonomy and independence or sovereignty emerge. But I think it's a much broader pool of reasoning, and it would be too simplistic to say it's all about semiconductors. That's not something. It's of course a huge industry problem, but not something that should call for a strategic direction of Europe. And I'm sure that's not the only reason. And I think when it comes to more digital, less tangible dependencies that you mentioned, which I wouldn't necessarily call dependencies, I think this is again much broader and definitely more flexible than shortage of specific tools needed to perform business or production. And here we are. I think what we should be looking into is what is the status quo? Even if Europe was to claim autonomy or sovereignty, what are the chances then to catch up with the rest of the world? And maybe looking at the reapproachment we're witnessing today and in the past few months, maybe I'm going to bring in this concept, maybe strategic interdependence is also a mean to help Europe get stronger, just like the MEP was saying today on the panel. There is a lot to strengthen, and realistically looking at capabilities and resources available, and figuring out what can allies provide to each other to catch up on the individual technological strength. And this is frankly where I also see the role for the industry that I represent. And I think Google has been an important source for success for many European companies, and especially when we think ahead about cloud opportunities, this could only become more of a fact going forward. And I do not believe that the autonomy discussion is happening in isolation. I don't believe we're all starting from the same point. I think there's certain legacy in the background and a lot of challenges ahead. And again, I'm very excited that we're having this conversation on a day where hopefully we're going to talk about the new chapter of the Transatlantic Tech Cooperation that will be of mutual benefit, that will respect the rights and expectations of the both sides of the Atlantic, will let the industry grow, will let this great economic relationship flourish, but in more concrete terms will also help Europe grow, not to have a reason when we meet same time next year to again touch upon concepts of autonomy.
Marta, that's an excellent note to end on, and the idea of strategic interdependence is, I think, a good starting point or a good theme for the Trade and Tech Council, and hopefully we'll be able to meet here in a year and talk about the agenda items that they have laid out and maybe even some objectives that they've actually achieved. Thank you so much to Fran Burwell, Anna Michelle Asimakopoulou, Anna Fielder, and Marta Poslad for being in this round with us. This concludes this round, and then we will be back here. We're going to take a coffee break. Coming back here in Maria Theresia will be Global Perspectives on Fighting COVID-19 with some great guests. And on the main stage on Habsburg at 3 p.m., there will be Precious Space, a string of satellites and the future of influence. So that will also be interesting and take up some of these issues. I want to thank the panelists and thank the audience, and this was a great discussion. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.